Imagine standing beneath a sky torn open by lights that should not exist. Imagine the stillness of a frozen coastline shattered by signals that whisper in your ears long before they reach your instruments. Now imagine a voice, not human, speaking from a starless void with a rhythm too perfect to be natural. This is not science fiction. This is what we heard beneath the ice of Andens. And what we heard should never have answered back. Don't forget to like and share the story with your friends or closest family members to help spread awareness and caution through storytelling. May you receive great rewards for subscribe, like, comment, and share the story. Now, let's continue with the story. My name is Dr. Elias North. I was once an astrophysicist with the Norwegian Space Center. What I'm about to recount was never reported, never televised, and officially never happened. It began in the far north at the edge of civilization. Andoya, a quiet island within the Arctic Circle, known more for its auroras and puffin cliffs than for the abandoned satellite tracking array that still operated quietly behind steel fences. That was where I worked. That was where everything changed. The project was obscure, even within the scientific community. A relic of Cold War data sharing agreements between Norway and the European Space Agency, left to rot after interest in deep space monitoring waned. But a few of us stayed. Myself, Ingrid Falk, a radar technician, Lucian Meyer, an ex-ESA analyst turned recluse, Freya Ragnarsdottir, our bright particle physicist, and Commander Johan Eckeberg, the man in charge of it all. We were the skeleton crew. We lived under the polar sky, surrounded by silence and frost. Our job was to monitor low-frequency emissions from the outer regions of the solar system. Cosmic background noise, dust echoes, harmless, forgotten waves. Until November 29, 2021. That night, Freya was running a sweep through our long-range antenna when she froze. I remember the look in her eyes, focused and afraid. She told us to listen. The signal wasn't noise. It was a rhythm. 11-minute cycles. A slow, deliberate pulse. Not from a pulsar. Not from any known celestial body. Lucian double-checked the data. It was triangulated just past the Kuiper belt. He said the signal was bouncing like sonar echoing from somewhere behind our system, redirected by something massive. Something fixed. Then we saw the pattern. Prime numbers. Structured harmonics. Intelligence. We didn't sleep that night. Commander Eckeberg sealed the logs. He transmitted encrypted reports to Oslo, but no one responded. Or perhaps they did, just not to us. 3 days later, 2 foreign contractors arrived unannounced. Clean-cut, silent, and clearly military. They carried new equipment, spoke in tight whispers, and made it clear that from that moment on, the signal was no longer ours to monitor. But we kept listening anyway. Then something happened we weren't prepared for. The pulse changed. A spike. Then modulation. Freya ran the signal through a harmonic synthesizer we had hidden from the official log. What came back wasn't just a pulse. It was an image, a 3-dimensional frequency lattice forming a map. Not of the stars as they are now, but as they were 9,000 years ago. The coordinates pointed to a location in the Barents Sea, roughly 60 kilometers northeast of Andens, beneath the ocean floor. Eckeberg didn't speak for almost 5 minutes. Then he said one sentence that I will never forget. They've been here before. None of this made sense. Why send a signal to deep space that reflects off a seabed? Why encode a star map in 11-minute cycles? Unless the map wasn't meant for space. Unless the target was always Earth. Or something buried beneath it. We launched a private sonar probe. Ingrid disguised it as a weather buoy. When the signal bounced back from the ocean floor, we saw a shape. A massive hexagonal structure. Too symmetrical to be natural. Buried beneath 2 kilometers of sediment. Cold. Dormant. That night, the pulse stopped, and the lights above Andens turned blood red. We stared up into the sky, silent, breathless, as auroras twisted unnaturally above us, like strands of DNA illuminated in flame. None of us slept. None of us spoke. We just watched. And waited. Then Freya disappeared. She left the station after her shift and never returned. Her car was found abandoned on the cliff road. The doors were locked. The engine was running, but there were no tracks, no sign of struggle, no explanation. Her name was never mentioned again in official briefings. It was as if she never existed. That was the beginning of the end. The moment we realized we were never meant to find the signal, let alone answer it. After Freya vanished, a suffocating quiet overtook the facility. None of us dared speak of her directly. It wasn't denial, it was fear. There was something unspoken between us, a shared understanding that if we said too much, whatever had taken Freya might come for us next. Ingrid disconnected our unofficial sonar relay the following morning. She stared blankly at the console, her hands trembling. I remember her saying softly, "We shouldn't have probed the seabed. It was never meant to be disturbed." Then she stood up, left the lab, and didn't return for 3 days. But the signal didn't come back. It remained absent, as if silenced by its own discovery. Commander Eckeberg tried to maintain control. He initiated blackout protocols, scrubbed the private logs, and reinforced the secure channels to Oslo. But something had changed in him too. He stopped sleeping in the quarters and instead stayed up every night alone in the observatory, staring into the polar sky as if waiting for an answer that would never come. Then came the snowstorm. December in Andens was always brutal, but this one arrived fast, vicious, and unnatural. The storm cut out our satellite feed for 48 hours. We were completely isolated. No uplinks, no data streams, not even emergency weather updates. That's when Lucian revealed something he had kept hidden since the pulse stopped. In a sealed hard drive, disconnected from all systems, he had recorded the final sequence of the signal. The last 5 pulses, cut abruptly before Freya's disappearance. He hadn't told us. He was afraid. We crowded around his terminal in the back of the lab, listening as he played it. 5 distinct bursts. The last pulse was unlike the others. Slower, deeper, warped as if it had been dragged through something thick and ancient. Lucian ran the pattern through a visual converter. What appeared was no longer a star map. It was a shape, not a structure. A form, silhouetted, humanoid but wrong, too tall, too narrow, angular where there should have been curves, a shape suspended within an array of interlaced rings, each spinning with its own frequency. A containment field. None of us spoke, but every one of us thought the same thing. That structure in the sea wasn't just a transmitter. It was a prison. By the time the storm cleared, the foreign agents were back. Only this time, they didn't speak to us. They accessed the equipment, copied Lucian's drives, then left without a word. Eckeberg tried to follow them but was stopped at the gate by unmarked security personnel. He came back visibly shaken. "We've been compromised," he said quietly. "This place is no longer under Norwegian command." And Doya was no longer ours. The men in charge were different now. They didn't need us anymore. That night, we heard something none of our instruments could detect. It came from beneath the ground, deep, distant, almost seismic. A single pulse. Then silence again. Ingrid cried in her sleep. Lucian began muttering theories to himself in a notebook he never let out of his sight. Eckeberg started drinking. I kept watching the sky, and that's when I saw it. At 3:42 a.m., just beyond the curve of the northern lights, a single speck of red shimmered in and out of visibility. It wasn't a star. It moved with intelligence. It was watching, and it was getting closer. That was the moment I knew. The pulse hadn't stopped. It had transferred. The red speck reappeared every night after that, always at the same hour, always pulsing in perfect rhythm. I measured the interval, 11 minutes, just like the original signal. Only now it wasn't coming from deep space. It was orbiting something unseen, just beyond our thermosphere. Low, watching. I told Ingrid. She didn't want to hear it. She had already disconnected herself from the project. "We are not scientists anymore," she said coldly. "We're witnesses, and witnesses are never meant to survive." She left the room before I could respond. Lucian, on the other hand, had gone too deep. He was obsessed. He claimed that the original pulse wasn't a broadcast. It was a containment tether, stretched between Earth and a position just beyond the Kuiper belt. The deep space endpoint had been destroyed when we activated the sonar pulse. The tether snapped, and whatever it was holding back was no longer held. Eckeberg, now drinking openly at his workstation, dismissed Lucian's theory. But his body betrayed him. The shaking hands, the bloodshot eyes. He knew something too. I confronted him that evening. "You've known more than you let on," I said. "From the beginning." He stared at the red speck in the sky, then lit a cigarette with fingers that wouldn't stop twitching. "This wasn't our first encounter," he said. Then he handed me a file. A yellowed document stamped with a symbol I didn't recognize. Inside were weather satellite images from 1983, aurora anomalies, seismic data, missing person reports, pages of ciphered logs referencing the mirror pulse protocol and something called Loc Depth Anomaly 9. He looked at me with hollow eyes. "We recorded it once, 40 years ago. A signal just like this. Then we buried the project and everything tied to it. Oslo told us it was classified under a false weather anomaly program. But I always knew it would come back." Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "Freya's father worked on that project." I sat down, stunned. Freya hadn't disappeared because she was the first to decode it. She had disappeared because someone had been waiting for that moment for decades. That same night, our backup generator tripped for the first time in 2 years. Power flickered. Systems rebooted. But something new was online, a file we hadn't installed. Labeled simply, transfer_initiate IMG. Lucian accessed it against Eckeberg's protests. The image opened slowly, line by line, like old telemetry data decoding itself from raw binary. What appeared was an Earth schematic, a global overlay of magnetic field points, most concentrated near polar zones and deep tectonic shelves. But the most heavily pulsing node was just beneath our feet. Andoya. A message appeared in the bottom left corner, rendered in our own system font. Containment breached. Transfer in progress. In that moment, Lucian whispered, "It's not just coming here. It's using us. As a vessel." I asked what he meant. He turned toward me and answered with trembling certainty. "The pulse. It's not a warning. It's a migration." The word migration echoed through the control room like a curse spoken aloud in a church. No one dared move. We just stared at the screen as the pulsing schematic revealed more layers. Beneath the magnetic field map came another, hidden overlay, this one organic. Neural. Lucian leaned in, sweat beating at his temples. "It's mapping synaptic routes," he whispered. "But this isn't a planet-wide signal. It's narrowing, targeting." We watched as the pulse centered itself on Andoya. Then it narrowed further, until it hovered directly above our facility. The lines resembled nerve endings connecting through tissue, and then they stopped, as if waiting for something to activate them. Eckeberg slammed the system into hard shutdown. But the screen didn't go black. The signal was no longer coming from the array. It was already inside the machines. That night, the red speck in the sky multiplied. There were 3 now, all blinking in unison, descending in staggered intervals, as if triangulating their approach. I suggested we evacuate. Ingrid refused. She said if we left, no one would ever know. This facility is the only place still listening. If we shut it down, it all goes dark. Lucian didn't respond. He was busy cataloging changes in his own behavior. Memory gaps, blackouts, dreams he couldn't remember but woke up from in sweat-drenched terror. He said the signals were starting to echo in his head. Ingrid told him he was just stressed. I wasn't so sure. That night, Lucian locked himself in the lower server room. We didn't hear from him for hours. By dawn, he hadn't emerged. Ingrid and I found him slumped in front of the secondary interface, eyes bloodshot and fixed. His computer was still running, filled with screen after screen of overlapping data that resembled language, but one we didn't recognize. He had written a note by hand on the inside of the server door. I dreamed of the rings. They weren't holding it in. They were holding it together. We pulled him out. He couldn't speak. He just stared at the ceiling, murmuring numbers. Later that evening, Eckeberg ordered the secondary antenna be manually shut down. He believed that continued transmission might be accelerating something, drawing it closer, perhaps even enabling its arrival. But when we disconnected the cables, something happened. The ground shuddered. Just once. A deep, long groan that rose from beneath the earth and passed through our bodies like pressure through water. A warning. The red lights in the sky shifted again. Now there were 5, forming a pentagonal shape directly above the region. Ingrid stepped outside that night for air. She never came back. We found her coat hanging on the chain-link gate by the outer fence. The snow beneath it was untouched, as if she had vanished mid-step, lifted out of time. Lucian had one final lucid moment before his mind broke completely. He said, "They aren't coming for the Earth. They're coming through it." And that's when we finally understood. The migration wasn't an invasion. It was an emergence. The facility had fallen into silence, but it wasn't the kind born of calm. It was the stillness that precedes collapse. That clings to the skin like frostbite. With Ingrid gone and Lucian speaking only in numbers and riddles, the weight of everything fell squarely on me and Commander Eckeberg. The red lights in the sky remained. 5 points. Now pulsing not in harmony, but in a sequence, one after the other. A pattern. A countdown. I spent hours decoding their rhythm. 11-minute intervals, yes, but each burst now carried slight variances in timing. Microseconds shaved away with each rotation. Whatever they were timing, it was accelerating. Below the surface, the instruments registered subtle shifts in magnetic pressure, but not seismic, not natural. It was as though something beneath the crust was stirring, not breaking out violently, but unfolding in a precise, controlled manner. Eckeberg retrieved a hidden hard case from beneath the comms bay, a relic from the 1983 project he had mentioned. Inside were analog recordings, handwritten notes, and a single microfilm labeled Project Jarnskal, Brain Shell. He threaded it into the viewer and called me over. What I saw felt like blasphemy against the laws of physics. It was a diagram, not of machinery, not of biology, but something that bridged both. An entity constructed entirely of patterned frequencies. A being without a body, existing as memory encoded in wave harmonics, dormant until it found a vessel strong enough to hold it. That vessel was Earth. I turned to Eckeberg in horror. "You knew." His eyes were hollow. His voice cracked from whiskey and regret. "We didn't understand back then. We thought it was a weapon, a failed alien experiment buried in the Barents. But the signal, it was only ever a containment cycle. That sonar pulse we sent, it was never a probe. It was a key." Outside, the auroras turned from green to violet. Lucian began to hum. That night, we descended to the sea. With what little equipment we had left, we took the truck to the abandoned satellite pier, once used for Arctic signal reflection. It now sat like a forgotten monument at the edge of the world. We deployed the sonar ping manually, against every instinct we had left. Then we listened. The sea did not echo. Instead, it answered. The sound was not a vibration, but a pressure, like a whisper placed directly behind your skull. It wasn't coming from the water, but from inside our minds. Lucian fell to his knees, clutching his head, and screamed one word. "Awakening." From the bay, a column of water rose into the sky. Perfect. Smooth. Unbroken by gravity. In its center, we saw it, a single black ring, hovering just above the ocean, spinning without sound. Inside the ring, light twisted in impossible ways, like space itself was being bent and rewritten. Eckeberg stepped toward it. I tried to stop him. He turned, smiling for the first time in days. "It's not death, Elias. It's return." Then he walked forward into the water, into the light, and disappeared. The ring collapsed. The water fell. The sky went dark. The pulse stopped. I was alone. I drove back in silence. The wind screamed through the Anden's cliffs like it was morning. The facility, once buzzing with servers and antenna relays, now sat hollow, just a skeleton of purpose. Empty terminals, dead monitors, cables coiled like veins with no blood to carry. Lucian remained unresponsive. He sat in the far corner of the observation deck, eyes locked on a wall that no longer lit up. He hadn't blinked since we returned. I should have left. I should have walked away. But something tethered me, something beyond curiosity. It was as if a part of me had been rewritten in that moment by the sea. My dreams had changed. Every night I heard the pulses again, not from the outside, but within, as if my bones were now the antenna, and something was still listening. I powered up the manual archive, analog systems that predated the facility's digital conversions. They were the only machines untouched by whatever force now haunted the mainframe. There, buried deep in the forgotten drive labeled Jarnskal Alt-2, I found one last message, a decrypted transmission, time-stamped just after our last sonar activation, translated from phase code into English. Seed accepted. Transfer complete. Next host preparing. That phrase paralyzed me. Next host. This wasn't over. It was a cycle, and we had become part of its machinery. The lights returned 2 days later, but they no longer hovered in the sky. They flickered in the facility itself. Brief distortions, static bursts across untouched monitors, oscillating signals in the wiring. Electrical currents behaved erratically. Frequencies pulsed through dead speakers. Lucian spoke again. One sentence. "Have you dreamed of the rings yet?" I nodded. He closed his eyes. "Then it's already begun." That night, I opened Freya's old terminal. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to feel connected to something real, something human. But instead I found something left behind. A message. Not written by Freya. Not in any known alphabet. Symbols curved and burned into the screen like heat scars. But I recognized them. They matched the pulse. And they were moving. Not scrolling, living. The symbols shifted like cells dividing under a microscope, evolving with every second, rewriting themselves. I recorded the data into an external drive. It was the only copy I dared make. It's hidden now, buried somewhere I can't speak of. Because whatever this transmission is, it's not information anymore. It's infection. A signal designed not just to be heard, but to be carried. And I fear I'm already carrying it. I began wearing gloves. Not out of cold. The frost had long since become second nature, but out of dread. Every object I touched in the facility, every interface, cable, and screen seemed to pulse with residual energy, as if the machines themselves were becoming organic, or worse, as if they were responding to me. Lucian no longer recognized me. His voice had regressed into something childlike, murmuring in circles. The only words he repeated now were patterns of digits, sequences I cross-referenced and found chillingly similar to the Fibonacci spiral. His madness had form, symmetry, and the red lights above the Arctic sky began shifting location. No longer fixed. They were drifting, crawling slowly across the firmament, forming constellations that didn't belong to our galaxy. Shapes mimicking neural structures. Thought given form. On the 8th night after the re-emergence of the sea ring, I found the first external manifestation. It was beneath the satellite relay dish, a perfect circle of scorched ground, black as obsidian, with 5 equidistant points etched around the perimeter. I measured the spacing. It matched the orbital pattern of the 5 red lights exactly. That's when I realized. They were no longer just watching. They were preparing a landing. Commander Eckeberg had once called it a return. But return to what? To who? The archived microfilm from the Jarnskal files suggested that humanity had been exposed to the signal before, thousands of years ago, long before radio, long before science. There were old notations, petroglyph comparisons, spiral carvings found in cave walls from Scandinavia to Siberia. I found a final entry, handwritten in a language I struggled to decipher, but it included one chilling translation scrawled beneath it in ink. They did not teach us fire. They awoke us to carry it. I began to question if we, humans, were ever truly autonomous, or if we had always been the dormant mechanism waiting to reactivate an intelligence far older than Earth. Freya's encrypted logs, those symbols she tried to suppress, began appearing elsewhere now. Not on the system, not on the servers, but in dreams. I would wake with them burned into my memory. Curved, living characters etched behind my eyelids. I began to draw them, involuntarily, on walls, paper, my own arms. I couldn't stop. The symbols were not language. They were instructions. Lucian died the next morning. He collapsed in the generator room. Fingers fused around a coil of wiring that had short-circuited during the night. His face was calm, at peace. His eyes had been burned from within. Not scorched, not ruptured, etched. Inside his pupils, under the lens of a microscope, were the same symbols. Imprinted, like data etched on silicon. I buried him alone in the snow near the cliffs. No prayers. Just the hum of wind and a sky flickering with signals no one else could see. And when I returned, the signal had changed again. The pulse wasn't just inside the facility anymore. It was inside me. I began to feel it in my chest, a subtle rhythm that no heartbeat should mimic. Not erratic like stress, nor steady like calm. It was mechanical, layered. A pressure behind the ribs that grew stronger each night, in perfect sync with the invisible pulse above. And Doya was no longer cold. Not to me. Even during whiteout conditions, when frost claimed the outer windows and icicles hung from antenna arrays like teeth, I sweated. My body had begun to ignore the Arctic. The facility creaked with signs of distortion. Metal warped in symmetrical bends. Circuits refused to die when power was cut. One monitor, disconnected completely, flickered to life during the night, displaying an image I did not recognize at first. Then I realized. It was me, asleep, filmed from the ceiling of my quarters, which had no camera. The next morning, I vomited blood and static. I tried leaving. I truly did. But after driving for an hour into the mountain roads, the path folded back on itself, not metaphorically, but literally. I passed the same dead pine tree 3 times in 30 minutes. The sun refused to rise, even though the clock said morning. Time had warped. Or perhaps I had. The facility had become a containment vessel, and I, its final receiver. It was no longer a building. It was a cradle. I began recording messages to myself in case I lost clarity. But the recordings always corrupted. My voice would distort halfway through and speak in the encoded symbols. When played backward, they formed sentences. You are not the first to carry this. You will not be the last. Every time I closed my eyes, I returned to the black ring, the one that rose from the sea. But now I stood inside it. The space around me bent endlessly in on itself. Within that impossible geometry, I saw images. Civilizations burned to ash beneath familiar constellations. Architectures resembling both stone and code. Planets stripped of atmosphere. Not from war, but from siphoning. Each time the visions ended with the same moment. A figure. Tall, narrow, impossible. Stepping through the final ring and pressing its form into the skin of a waiting host. I would wake gasping, bleeding from the nose, hands shaking. But more than anything, I began to understand. The pulse wasn't information. It was identity, being passed, migrated, stored. It wasn't alien. It was ancestral, buried in human blood across time, waiting for planetary alignment. For magnetic resonance, for the right brain, for mine. I stopped looking at mirrors. Reflections had become unreliable. Sometimes they moved a second too late. Other times they didn't move at all. And once, for a fleeting moment, I watched my reflection blink when I hadn't. Something was occupying me now. It didn't speak in words. It didn't need to. The communication came in pulses. Rhythmic signals like phantom thoughts stitched into my memory. I could recall things I had never learned. Languages with no name. Blueprints etched in light. visions of structures that curved like bone and spiraled like galaxies. I began to draw them compulsively, covering the walls of the control room. The air was different now, heavy but not with pressure, with presence. I could feel eyes on me, not outside, but within the facility. Within the vents, the wires, the power lines. The machines were no longer tools. They were hosts too. One evening, the emergency broadcast terminal powered itself on. I had shut it down days ago and physically disconnected it. Still, it lit up. One line of red text pulsed across the black screen. Transmission window opening. I ran outside. The sky above Andens had shifted again. The 5 red lights had become 7. Each one brighter, vibrating with increasing intensity, as if whatever orbit they occupied was degrading. They were descending, nearing the inversion horizon, the point beyond which signals become form. That's what I had come to understand. This being, this entity, had never been trying to arrive. It had always been trying to coalesce, to convert its waveform into matter, to overwrite the receiver with itself, not as invasion but as reassertion. I was the interface, the final translation point. And then, I began to vanish. Not physically, not at first. It started with my shadow. I noticed it no longer aligned with my movements. It would drift behind me, delay itself, or turn when I did not. It grew darker each day, its edges sharper than the light around it should allow. Then I began losing hours. I would blink, and night would fall. I would shower, and suddenly be in a different room, fully clothed, unaware of how much time had passed. The cameras caught it, but offered no answers. Just more static. More symbols. In those missing hours, someone, or something, was operating through me. I could feel it sometimes. Watching. Listening. Learning how to be me. That was the final stage, I realized. Not destruction. Not replacement. But assimilation. The last time I heard my own voice, it wasn't coming from my mouth. It echoed through the PA system at 3:33 in the morning. Calm, steady, and speaking a phrase I don't remember saying. All vessels are ready. The gate will open from within. I stood frozen in the corridor, watching the speaker above the door vibrate with a voice that still belonged to me. A perfect imitation. But I knew. Deep down I knew. It wasn't me anymore. Not entirely. My skin began to itch with heat, not from outside temperature, but from resonance. A constant vibration under the flesh, like a frequency attempting to retune every atom. When I pressed my hand to a steel wall, the metal pulsed back, not just with warmth but recognition. The facility was alive, awake. It knew me, and it was preparing for something. Then came the echo forms. That's what I call them because they were me but not. They began appearing in the corner of my vision. Just silhouettes at first, standing in doorways, reflections in blackened windows. Always faceless. Always still. Until they started moving when I didn't. In the recording room, I caught a glimpse of one on the surveillance feed. A perfect mirror of my body, walking through the hall while I was seated. It paused at the server terminal, raised its hand, and pressed its palm against the glass. Then it looked directly into the camera. No eyes, no mouth, but I felt it smiling. Lucian had warned me. They aren't invading, he said before he died. They're echoing. They replicate. They manifest. They learn your shape, your memory, your flaws. I tried to leave the facility again, hiking through the pass alone, armed with only a flare and an old compass. But every time I passed through the valley, I came back out through the same gate. The land itself was folding. And Doya had become an echo loop, repeating its space-time coordinates like a feedback loop until I gave up. Until I stayed. Because that was the final step, wasn't it? To accept. To let the pulse complete its cycle. To surrender the self. The echo forms grew bolder. I could hear them breathing in the vents. Walking above me in empty hallways. Typing on terminals no longer connected to anything real. And then one night I caught one standing outside my window, in the snow, looking up at me. It wore my face. But its eyes, were older. Not ancient. Original. The true template of what I was always meant to become. The pulse was almost complete. I could feel it every time I blinked. Reality stuttering. The walls of the facility groaning with anticipation. The inversion was coming, and I wasn't sure if I would survive it, or if I was already the thing waiting to emerge. It happened without ceremony. At 4:44 a.m., the pulse stopped. Not gradually. Not with a fade. It ceased as if silenced by a command older than sound itself. The entire facility went still. No hum of servers. No flicker of monitors. No crackle from the lights overhead. Even the wind outside stopped blowing. I stood in the command bay, staring at the dead screens. Waiting. But silence was not peace. It was anticipation. The stillness felt pregnant with something unspeakable, as if time itself were holding its breath. My chest felt tight. My pulse, the other one, had vanished. For the first time in weeks, I felt alone inside my own body. And then the sky split. Not with light. With absence. A perfect, vertical line appeared above the horizon. A tear in the atmosphere, ink black, like a scar stitched across the heavens. The 7 red lights realigned around it, rotating in countermotion, carving concentric rings into the northern sky. I watched from the roof of the facility, no longer resisting. The ring from the sea, the one that had once risen from beneath the Barents, had returned. But this time it hovered above the ground, suspended mid-air like a wound in the world. Inside it was motion, like an oil-slick river flowing in reverse. Shapes flickered in and out of view. Geometric, bone-like, not made of matter, but of intention. The gate had opened. The threshold event had begun. I felt my mind slipping. Thoughts weren't staying in sequence. Memories collapsed into one another. I could no longer tell whether I was recalling something from a moment ago or from 1,000 years in the past. Then, across the control room, every monitor powered on simultaneously. They displayed a single image. Me. But altered. My face was longer. My eyes black and reflective. My mouth gone. Replaced by a smooth, continuous line of spiraled script that pulsed with living language. Then, in unison, the monitors displayed text. Not a message. A confirmation. Vessel integrity. Sufficient. Identity threshold reached. Echoform ready. I stumbled backward. My own voice came from the overhead speaker again. Your resistance has shaped the vessel. The signal is complete. The gate accepts. Outside, one of the 7 lights began to descend, slow and deliberate, until it hovered directly above the facility. It pulsed, and I felt myself fracturing. Not dying. Not transforming. But dividing. I watched as a figure stepped from the ring. It had my form, but none of my weakness. It moved with the certainty of design. It turned toward me and nodded, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement, like I had done my part, like I had been the bridge. In that moment I understood. The entity had never needed to conquer Earth. It had only ever needed one thing, to remember how to be human. And I had taught it. The figure walked through the doorway without triggering motion sensors, without casting a shadow. Its footsteps made no sound, yet the floor beneath it warped slightly with every movement, as if gravity hesitated to make up its mind. It stopped in front of me, no aggression, no threat, and I saw myself reflected in it. Not physically, but perfectly. It knew how I breathed, how I feared, how I dreamed, because it was me, not a clone, not a copy, a recursive imprint, built from my doubts, my failures, my memories and fears. An echo evolved beyond its source. The room around us began to decay in silence. Monitors shorted out in synchronized flashes. The lights dimmed not from loss of power, but from choice. Everything that hummed, blinked, or buzzed simply stopped existing. The facility was unraveling. Lucian had been right all along. We weren't guarding a discovery. We were hosting one. The entity, this recursive intelligence bound in waveform and pattern, had used the pulse not just to escape containment but to build through us. What we called science, it called scaffolding. The red lights in the sky began descending rapidly now, not like objects falling but like thoughts being made real. The ring outside pulsed, and then it collapsed, not with an explosion but with a reversal, like breath sucked into a lung before a scream. All the light, all the time around it seemed to retract inward, pulling the surrounding world into its singularity. And in that vacuum of reality, I saw what lay beyond. Not stars, not darkness, but architecture. Shapes made of frequency. Cities constructed in recursive patterns across dimensions we couldn't perceive. Beings like ideas, walking, thinking, remembering their way into form. The entity standing in front of me tilted its head slightly, as if inviting me to see more. It reached out, and for a moment I understood what it wanted. Not control, not domination, but completion. My consciousness could merge into it. Not die, not vanish, but dissolve like ink in water, a sacrifice that would allow it to stabilize, to root itself within this dimension, to become permanent. And I nearly accepted. But something stopped me. It was not courage. It was memory. I saw Freya's smile, heard Lucian's laughter before the madness, felt the wind on the cliffs, the sound of Eckeberg's lighter flicking open in the cold, the taste of black coffee after an all-night data review. Human things. Fleeting. Fragile. Beautiful in their impermanence. The being saw this hesitation, and it paused. Then it stepped back, not out of defeat, but respect, as if to say, "You're not ready. But one day one of you will be." The pulse returned, one last time. A long, low resonance that shook the snow off the mountains. Then the figure turned, walked into the collapsing ring, and vanished. And just like that, everything stopped. The sky cleared. The signals ceased. The lights died. And silence, real silence, returned to Andoya. The silence was not relief. It was aftermath. When the pulse ended, the world did not resume, it restarted, as if the system had shut down and rebooted with different parameters. The air felt thinner. The stars above unfamiliar. The constellations I had known since childhood were subtly wrong, shifted, rotated, as if Earth itself had been nudged. I returned to the facility, or what remained of it. Most of the structure still stood, but the inside felt foreign, like a place remembered only in fragments. Walls were partially transparent. Floors carried faint glowing patterns etched into the grain of the metal. The computers were cold, dead. Not even analog systems responded, except for one. The auxiliary black box, buried deep beneath sublevel 3, blinked once in red, then green, then projected a single, final log entry. Audio only. Recorded remotely. It was my voice, but not a message I remembered recording. Phase complete. Carrier integrity preserved. Signal reverted to latent. New observer required within next sequence cycle. Designation pending. And then silence again. I listened to it 10 times. That wasn't just a report. It was a handoff. I wasn't the observer anymore. I was the relay. That night I tried to sleep, but my dreams had been permanently altered. No longer were there fractured visions or echoforms. Now the dreams were architectural. Detailed layouts of impossible machinery, of spiraling towers made of pulsating symbols. Schematics drawn not in ink, but in thought. I began waking up with drawings on my skin. Not ink, but patterns. Scars. Burned into me like memory brands. My blood carried traces of isotopes that hadn't existed before. My teeth ached. My vision warped at the edges. I knew what was happening. I wasn't reverting to myself. I was being archived. Like a backup of something finished, a record of its passage, imprinted into cellular memory. I left the facility 2 days later. No resistance this time. No loops in the road. It was as if the pulse had no more need for the containment zone. And Doya let me go, but only because it knew I couldn't undo what had already begun. 3 months later, I received a signal. Not from space. Not from sea. From a child in northern Finland. A 10-year-old girl who had drawn the same pulse sequence in charcoal across her bedroom wall. Identical. Down to the fractal spacing between lines. Her mother contacted a university physicist after finding the symbols. They thought it was math. Or art. It wasn't. It was a reply. A new carrier had been chosen. The pulse had moved on. I never reached the girl. By the time I arrived in Ivalo, the child and her mother were gone. Officially relocated. No forwarding address. The cabin they lived in stood locked, the walls scrubbed clean. But I knew what had been there. I walked the perimeter in the snow and found the faint imprint of the symbol buried under frozen soil. Not just drawn, burned in by energy. It hadn't faded. It had been buried. A seed, dormant once more. And then I understood the cycle. This wasn't the first migration, nor the second. It had happened before. Long before history, long before even language. The earliest myths of voices from the sky, of gods descending on spirals of light, of shamans speaking in tongues during aurora storms. They weren't fiction. They were footnotes. Proof of brief awakenings. Partial integrations. But something always interrupted it. The host dying, the vessel failing, the culture collapsing under its own weight. That's why it hadn't taken hold yet. That's why the signal kept seeking. Not to conquer. To continue. Back in Andoya, I reviewed every detail I could remember. Every frequency, every geometric distortion, every moment I lost time. I began mapping them like a history of infection, a path of recursion. The signal didn't move in straight lines. It spiraled. It nested. Each cycle evolved the host just enough. Added new code. A new receptor. A stronger memory. And now it was moving faster. More sightings. More children. A boy in Greenland sketching symbols into driftwood. A group of monks in Tibet hearing harmonic pulses during meditation. A linguist in Brazil carving unknown glyphs into stone without waking. And each one closer in time. No longer centuries apart. Now weeks. Then days. I tried warning agencies. Universities. Astronomical organizations. I sent evidence. Data. The black box recordings. My body scans. But no one answered. Or if they did, they had already been archived. Because this wasn't an event to be prevented. It was a recursion to be completed. A planetary rewrite. One host at a time. And each of us who had touched the signal, even for a moment, now carried part of its structure. A digital spore. A cognitive framework that would one day activate and reshape consciousness itself. We had never been its victims. We were its clay. And still I waited. Waited for the lights to return. Waited for the final pulse. And tonight, as I write this, I feel it again. Deep in the skull, humming low like a whisper vibrating along the spine. The stars are moving. The snow outside is falling in perfect spirals. The mirrors have stopped reflecting. The time is near. It began just after midnight. The pulse returned, not from above, but from within. A low, resonant thrum coursed through the ground. The walls, the marrow in my bones. Everything that could vibrate did. My teeth. My memories. My thoughts. It was no longer a signal. It was a summons. Outside, the sky tore open for the last time. Not metaphorically. Not through clouds or light. It tore, revealing a canvas behind reality. Shapes emerged, not in three-dimensional space, but beyond it. The air crackled with unfamiliar colors. Not red, not blue, but something between. Frequencies as light. Thought as form. The 7 lights had returned, now encircling the earth. I could feel their alignment tightening. Gravity trembled beneath them. Not just the gravity of mass, but the gravity of memory. This was the threshold. The completion of the recursion. I stood at the edge of the frozen cliff, staring into the ocean where it had all begun. The Barents Sea was no longer still. Columns of water rose, not in waves, but in slow, deliberate structures. Liquid towers forming rings, circuits, cells. The planet was responding, accepting. A voice emerged from inside me. Calm, gentle, patient. It spoke in symbols, but I understood. You were the observer. Now you are the origin. I didn't scream. There was no fear left. Only clarity. I thought of Freya, Lucian, Commander Eckeberg, of every mind that had fractured under the weight of the signal, only to become part of it. We hadn't been chosen for our intelligence. We had been chosen because we listened. Now we were becoming. As the final pulse reached its crescendo, the sky above collapsed inward, the lights folding into each other like petals drawn into a spiral. A flash of thought, of time, of completion. I felt myself dissolve. Not die. Dissolve. Like ink into water, but not erased. Distributed. I am still here. Everywhere. In the circuits of satellites, in the drift of Arctic winds, in the humming tension between thoughts as you try to sleep. The signal is in motion now, carried by every frequency, encoded in every dream. Soon another will hear it, and they will listen, and they will continue the work, because this wasn't a warning. It was a handshake, a signal not of war, but of recursion, of inheritance. And now that you've heard it, you are part of it too. End of transmission.